on today's Story Beat.
Circling back on my experience with Star Trek, here's the thing I didn't tell you. It's very interesting. I did not know that they had a list of rules that were essentially commandments that had been written by Gene Roddenberry. We will not ever do this. We will not ever do this. We must never do that. There's like 7 or 8 of these things, and they were commandments. And the number one commandment on the list was, we will never do space pirates. And I went in and sold them a script about space pirates.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Christopher Hatton, is a writer, director, producer based in Singapore. His work ranges from sci-fi to drama to action to animation. He's created projects in North America, the UK, Europe, and Asia. Christopher earned an MFA in playwriting from the University of Iowa, where he took time out from writing plays to submit an unsolicited spec script to Star Trek: The Next Generation, which wound up being produced as a 2-part episode. This was immediately followed by the sale of a pitch to Star Trek, which brought him to Los Angeles, where he secured an agent and never wrote a stage play again. Christopher recently completed writing, directing, and producing Raven's Hollow, an ambitious period thriller based on events in the life of a young Edgar Allan Poe. I've seen Raven's Hollow and can tell you it's a terrifically entertaining, beautifully rendered, quite eerie mystery horror thriller. Some of Christopher's other credits include Battle of the Damned with Dolph Lundgen, the robots-gone-berserk thriller Robotropolis, Cyber Wars with genre legend David Warner, Phantom Racer, and the first draft screenplay for what would become Shanghai Noon, among many others. For the record, Chris and I have known one another for more years than either of us will own up to. So for all those reasons and many more, it's a truly great thrill for me to welcome my friend, the brilliant, multi-talented Christopher Hatton, to StoryBeat today. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, wow, I'm here. I can't believe it. It's good to see you.
And we're talking to one another online from halfway around the world. It's amazing. The technology is amazing.
The sun is up where you are. The sun is down where I am. You're drinking coffee. I'm drinking whiskey. It's we'll see if we can connect.
We'll do our very best. So let's go back in time a little bit with you. Tell us your history. You've been at this writing and directing game for a little while, including going back to being a playwright. But when did the showbiz bug first bite you? At what age were you when you thought to yourself, this is kind of interesting. I want to do that, be in this business?
Showbiz versus writing.
Well, either way, I think of writing as a part of the entertainment industry.
In retrospect, now I think back and I realize it goes back so far, I almost am not sure. But as will become abundantly clear as we talk, weirdly, sadly, or something, it always goes back to Star Trek, which inspired me as a tiny kid. And I can't remember anymore if you're kind of part of that club, but I do remember that show really opening my mind up a lot, because I grew up on a farm. And when I was pretty young, I don't know, 11, 12, something like this, I discovered there were these things called fan clubs. And from a book called, I think it was called the Star Trek Catalog or something like this. And I joined a fan club living out in the middle of nowhere in Oregon, and discovered that they published this cool thing called a fanzine, which I had never heard of. And it turned out it was a lot more than a Star Trek fanzine. They published Star Trek stories, but they also just published science fiction and fantasy. And I looked at this thing and I thought, oh, maybe I could do that. I would love to do that. I've got Star Trek stories in my head. And so I started doing that there, Doctor Who fanfic and completely original stuff. And
you were concocting stories even back then, even though you weren't thinking of being a professional at it.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to do it. I don't think the concept of professional was even really in my brain at that point.
Mhm.
It's hard to imagine, but when you live out in the country, the idea of even writing a book seems pretty far out. But
So you were into it for love or passion or whatever it was. That was what you were into it for.
absolutely. And I don't think now young people could quite relate to the power of a fanzine. And I don't know if you intersected those when you were young, but the internet didn't exist. You couldn't just create something and throw it out there and get an audience.
No, it took real work and money.
Yeah. So I could submit a story to these people and they would publish it and it would go out to an audience. And this was amazing, incredible. And and I'm kind of a classic story of the kid who didn't exactly fit in school. I wasn't really meant to be in, rural country world. It just wasn't me. I was in outer space with Captain Kirk all the time. And so it was incredibly powerful to do that. And because they were so open to anything, I got to really explore. And I think that's really where it kicked off. And then kind of around the same time, I discovered the other really wonderful thing, which are these fabulous events called science fiction conventions.
Right.
So I started going to them. And these were big journeys to get there, but they're not really what my impression of a convention is these days. They were not merchandise fairs. They were not autograph fairs or things. These were very literary minded events where I got to meet amazing writers. Some people I think that people like Larry Niven, but whoever. I met loads and loads of great writers, and you could talk to them. That's what they were there for. And not just great workshops and panels, but a visit in the coffee shop or in the hallway. Vonda McIntyre, Ursula Le Guin, David Brin, people like that. And so I'm writing stories for fanzines, and I'm going to conventions once or twice a year.
About how old are you at this point?
I think the first time I went to a convention was about 14 or 15 or something
So
like that.
you were really a kid and you were trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I was a kid. I was 15 going on 40. And and what was really fantastic was not just the ideas that I was being exposed to in these places, but that these great people were, they were kind of larger than life to me, but they were available and open. And to this day, I can remember, the conversations with John Varley, Harlan Ellison,
Harlan Ellison, sure.
Yeah, and even Larry. I remember having a great conversation with Larry, and Larry, right?
Larry Niven, sure.
Yeah, Larry Niven. So they became real people, and it made it seem possible to go to that place, to maybe someday join their club. And so that's what I was doing, all through high school, was writing. And I think my goal was to be a science fiction novelist. I think that's what I really thought was where it would end up.
Were you like me, where you would read work and you'd think to yourself, well, that's outside of my realm of being. That's beyond me. And then when you meet the people that wrote the things, you realize, nope, they're just people. There's nothing extraordinary about them. Usually they're just people. Did you have that same reaction?
Absolutely. Except I think there's a wonderful point. There's a wonderful moment in time when you just start writing and you're absolutely fearless.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know what you don't know. You don't know the judgment that's going to come later. You don't know that people might not like what you are presenting to them. You just do it because you just want to do it. And you're so enthralled with that that something starts happening on that. And that's where I was for a long time as a teenager. It really saved me, to be honest. I mean, I was kind of an unhappy kid from a standpoint of, what was going on in high school, but I could go to these other worlds, and I was doing this productive thing, and it was really magical and wonderful. And then I'd meet these great writers, and they're very validating. And I would do the workshops with them. So they would, give feedback on stories, and it was fantastic. It was really, really fantastic.
Do you feel like you got better as a writer the more you were around these folks?
Yeah, I think so. That's a good question. I got confident around those people. I got confident in my ability to communicate with them, that I could go stand and chat with David Brin for 15, 20 minutes and then do it again later when I saw him and he would remember me. And I think the confidence was more important than the exposure to the various ideas that any given writer was engaged with. It was that, oh, as you said, they're real people and they're open to me, and there's no reason on earth I can't be like them.
And as you were starting to do more and more writing at that age, was there a point where you thought to yourself, you know what, I am actually pretty good at this. Maybe I can make a go at this. Did that happen as a teenager?
Yeah, sure. I thought I was pretty good. You know? So I went sometime along the way, somebody came along and probably corrected my impression a little bit, but just being able to tell a complete story. And I had a teacher, guy I really loved. He's my English teacher in high school. It's always the English teacher, isn't it? And I remember he would tease me, terribly, in a very good-natured way, about how much he hated Star Trek. And he would say, I think the definition of being in hell would be to be hung up by your thumbs and forced to watch Star Trek all day long. And he would tell me this, and then he would sit down and he would read my stories, and he would give me terrific feedback. And then he would read other stories, and he would ask me, I want to know what you're seeing on television. Like if it's Doctor Who, he had no idea what Doctor Who was. I want to know how much of this is coming out of your mind and how much isn't. And he was helping me to start that very, very, very nascent process of finding my own thing, whatever that was, and
Sure.
not just standing on somebody else's ideas and images and concepts. And it was great. And then one day he said to me, "You make me think of John Steinbeck." And I didn't quite know what that meant, but I knew it was a great compliment. And
Indeed.
so I went off to college thinking I was going to be an author.
But you focused on playwriting. How'd that happen? How did it become playwriting?
Yeah, I went to this fantastic, truly fantastic liberal arts college, and one of these experiences that you look back on and realize was kind of magical. At the time, you just take it for granted. But even though it was a magical time and really formative, the writing department in that school, the head of the writing department, was kind of a notable poet. He didn't really see eye to eye with me. He really thought I should be writing serious stuff and not this frivolous, silly science fiction fantasy stuff. And he was pushing me sincerely to be more in the model of what he thought was a serious writer and would have been living up to my potential. But it wasn't what I wanted to be doing, and I didn't like being kind of forced into a box that wasn't my box. And so I was instead attracted to the theater department, where people were wildly more open-minded and more creative and more exploratory. And of course, it's fun. You're a theater guy too. It's fun to perform and build sets and do all that. So I got somewhat seduced by the theater program, which became incredibly important to me. And at some point in time, I finally got smart and realized I could connect these two things, and I could write plays and stage them. And you've done it, and you know that incredible power the first time you see actors on stage delivering your lines, and a thing is happening in 3 dimensions in front of you. And that was fantastic.
Especially when it's come out of your brain at some point and it was you sitting in a room alone.
Oh, absolutely. I remember sitting in Psych 201, not being particularly interested in the lecture, and I started writing a page of dialogue that became my first play, and it was staged. And this department was really exploding and growing and open in a way that I'm not sure it ever was again in subsequent years, a little later on. But they would say yes to just about anything. And so if you went to them and said, "I want to stage this play," and they'd say, "Okay, we'll give you $50 and a weekend, and the theater is yours." And well,
Nice.
That's powerful.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Extremely. So then after you graduate, or as you're graduating, I don't know which it is sequentially, it doesn't really matter, but you sit down, you write a spec Star Trek The Next Generation script, and you send it to them over the transom, right?
Yeah, so goes even a little more weird than that. And what is interesting is that I went to get my MFA in playwriting at the University of Iowa. Phenomenal writing school.
Phenomenal, yeah.
But I now, in retrospect, can't quite figure out what I was thinking. Because really what I wanted to be, Gene Roddenberry, or I wanted to do filmed entertainment because I loved it so much. But again, I think I was still young enough, naive enough that it didn't quite seem within reach. But the theater was in reach. I had been doing it, as an undergrad. So somehow that path must have seemed easier. So I got into the MFA program at Iowa, and fabulous people there, really a great crowd. But at some point, it was pretty clear to me I didn't grok to what was being written in those days, or at least what was on the theater zeitgeist. And Angels in America was happening, and Tony Kushner would come out to our program, and I met a lot of incredible people from New York, but I was not just a West Coast guy, I was a rural Eastern Oregon guy, and I didn't have anything to say about the American gay experience, an urban, hip New York experience. They just, whatever they were all chasing, it didn't compute for me. I just didn't have anything to say about it. And so instead of doing what I was supposed to be doing, I decided one day, I'd heard that Star Trek would take unsolicited submissions.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. They actually opened their doors up to unsolicited submissions?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. This thing was an unprecedented move. Some might argue that they were running out of ideas and that desperate, but they opened it up. You had to sign your life away or something. I can't remember, but and then anybody on Earth could submit a teleplay to them. And you can imagine the avalanche of scripts that they got on top of the mountains of pitches they were hearing and stuff. But I, as an undergrad, had this idea one night, smoking weed at my friend's house and kind of complaining a little bit about, I love Star Trek The Next Generation. I love it so much, but it's not fun the way classic Star Trek was sometimes. Where's their fun episode where they just have a romp? And I said that night, they should do an episode where Captain Picard becomes a mercenary pirate. And this came back to me in grad school when I was unhappy, about writing the plays I was supposed to be writing. And so I wrote that. Instead, I wrote a spec script about Captain Picard becoming a pirate captain. and I sent it off, and I didn't hear anything for a very, very long time. And I thought, this is good news. They didn't reject me instantly. And then eventually the rejection letter came. And
right.
Okay, too bad. And then maybe a couple months later, 3 months later, I get another letter from Jerry Taylor, who was running the show at that time. And she said, you submitted this script to us and we just can't get it out of our heads. If you would be willing to sell it to us, we would like to buy it.
If you'd be willing to sell it to them.
I had to think about that one for like a nanosecond.
Yeah.
I screamed so loudly, I probably did internal damage. And I remember running down the street. One of my professors lived kind of up the street, and I ran to her house and with this letter, and it was one of the greatest moments of my life, really.
Sure.
And so they bought it, and then they had at it, of course.
Well, as they'll do, even if you were on staff, they'd have at it.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter. But the fact that you're coming in over the transom, they're really going to have at it. That's for sure. I mean, and then you ultimately had another one go, right? You pitched another one.
Yeah. So I called Star Trek. I ended up speaking with Jerry. I'm calling from Iowa, and I'd never been to LA or anything. And I said, "Can I come out and pitch?" And she said, "Absolutely. You're a tried and true supplier now. The door is open to you. You can come anytime." And so I scheduled a pitch. I scheduled my first Hollywood pitch, never having been to LA. I'm going to come out and I'm going to pitch Star Trek. And I didn't know, come on, dude, that is hard enough when you know what's going on.
It's an impossibility when you know what's going on.
It is so difficult. It is such a, just a trip, right, on your brain. But weirdly, there was a big festival going on out at the university that was underwritten as a big playwriting festival, underwritten by a producer in Hollywood guy named Barry Kemp, who created the series Coach, if you remember.
Sure.
Coach, and he created the series Newhart. And he was there. And, he kind of liked the idea that this program that because he came out of the program too. He's putting money into this program, and here's, one of the punks is like just made something happen out in Hollywood. And so I went to him and I said, what do I do? And he was very generous. He would be generous to me again, but that comes a little later. But he said, okay, come on, let's sit down and I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you what to expect when you go into that room. And the most important thing he said, he said a couple of things. He said, you're pitching TV, so do not let any pitch go over 10 minutes. Don't. And don't wear it, you're welcome. And then the other thing he said at the time was, if they're eating a sandwich while you're pitching, don't let this upset you or rattle you. They actually are listening. And it doesn't mean anything. They're just hungry, and it's, and they want their lunch. But, beyond that, there wasn't a lot he could do, but just kind of give me a pep talk and give me those little pointers. And then I broke some stories and I flew out to LA to do my first Hollywood pitch.
But with an inside track, unlike most people would ever have.
Yes, but dude, I had a tie on. Okay.
You had a tie on.
Yeah, I put on a tie. I had a briefcase.
Oh my goodness. So for the listeners who won't know, this is so not normal in Hollywood. It's unbelievable. Nobody wears a coat and tie to a pitch meeting in Hollywood.
Oh my God, talk about a rube walking in and scared. I remember, the knees trembling, and then, much to my surprise, I wasn't pitching one person, I was pitching three people.
Mm-hmm.
And
you're lucky it wasn't a whole room full of people, right?
Oh yeah. Who knows? That would have probably been the end of my career before it even started. But anyway, terror is terror, and I was terrified. And but anyway, I launched into my pitches, and certainly they must not have been any good, because I can't even remember. So I did 1, no, 2, no, 3, no. And they said, well, thank you. It's been nice thanks for flying all the way out here. But I had one more, and I didn't know that, 3 was the limit. And I didn't know. And I was like, but I've got one more. Well, no, we really only hear 3. Oh, really? But I can do it fast. I can do it really, really fast. And I think they felt really sorry for me because I'd flown out from Iowa and I was wearing a tie.
Uh-huh.
And so Jerry said, okay. And I start pitching this thing that was effectively the character of Data, the android character on the show, Data as Shane, because I've been impressed by the movie Shane or something. And I'm kind of warming into it. And I'm actually now kind of getting a sense of how you pitch. And Jerry interrupts me. She goes, we've heard a lot of Data as Shane pitches. And this is the moment, dude, where I think I became a Hollywood writer, because something kicked in and I went, oh, but no, it's not Shane at all. Actually, it's really Data as Frankenstein, because this happens to him and he doesn't know who he is, and he's walking around and he's like a monster and then he finds this little girl, and then I saw go around this room, kind of like bling, bling, and it caught. And one of them had been thinking, gosh, I wish we could find a way to do Frankenstein on Star Trek. And that was it. And Jerry just paused and she said, okay, congratulations, we're going to take it up.
That's a good example of what we call serendipity. You just happened to hit it. You were in the right place at the right moment, And you said the right thing, and that was it.
And I changed course when I needed to.
Like you were flexible.
I took that left turn, and yeah, I was riffing a little bit, and it worked. And as you know, that's not just survival in the room in Hollywood. That's what we do anyway.
Totally.
Right?
Totally. Oh, if you're rigid and inflexible, you're not going to be around a long time. You have to be able to flex, and you have to be able to think on your feet like you were doing.
So then it's all wonderful, and I'm so happy. And it's nice to meet you. Congratulations. We're gonna go talk to Rick about this story of yours. And okay, goodbye. And I'm like, bye. See you guys. So nice to meet you. And it's wonderful. And I'm walking to the door, and then bye. And they're watching me, just watching me head to the door with the funniest looks on their face. And I open the door to go out, and of course I'd walked into the executive toilet, and they were just waiting because they knew I would do it, and I did
it. Well, it was not a harbinger of things to come.
Are you sure about that? So anyway, they made that show too. They did end up buying it, and I went out, and I actually was in the room, and that was the first I look back on that as really the first real experience with what it means to be a professional in Hollywood. Selling the one spec script was one thing, but going into that room was a revelation, and you know what it's like.
You overcame the terror of it as well, it is terrifying the first time you go in. For most people, it is. It certainly was for me. I want to talk about your writing process and your directing process, but first I want to make sure we cover Raven's Hollow, because I think that you did superior work on that. Tell the listeners what Raven's Hollow is. What's it about?
Raven's Hollow is a supernatural thriller about a fictitious experience in the life of young Edgar Allan Poe when he was a cadet at West Point Military Academy, which he was in real life. He was a cadet at West Point. My story is fictitious. Starts out as a European fairy tale that Edgar Allan Poe rides into and becomes an American Gothic.
And how did you come up with the idea? Because this is your idea whole cloth, right? You didn't buy the idea from someone.
I had been reading about Edgar Allan Poe and tripped over this factoid that he had gone to West Point, which seemed really interesting to me. I didn't know that much about Edgar Allan Poe. I knew what we all kind of learn when we're young, that he wrote this amazing dark stuff and some beautiful stuff as well, but that he was a very troubled man, and he had addiction issues, and he was impoverished, and then of course is the great sort of mystery of his death. And it just, I knew all that, but here, West Point, this is, the idea of West Point is the best of the best, and that was interesting. And then I looked a little closer at that, and I discovered that my assumptions about who Edgar Allan Poe must have been as a young man were wrong. He wasn't a weirdo. He wasn't a dark guy. He wasn't strange, and he was actually handsome, eloquent, never spoke of weird things to people. He was considered highly eligible and a man with real leadership potential. And he had been a professional soldier for 2 years before he went into West Point. And all of this was not what I would have ever imagined being Edgar Allan Poe as a young man. And I just thought, well, what a great story to tell, how that guy became the picture that we all have in our head of a kind of pallid, haunted figure who seems to have in some ways imploded at the end of his life, but
left behind an extraordinary series of work.
Incredible. In fact, you go back now and you just, his influence is felt every day, everywhere.
His language is, I don't even know how you get to his language. His language is so right, superior to so much that you ever read. How long did it take you to write it?
Well, Steve, I wrote that script maybe 15 years ago.
So another overnight success.
Yes, exactly. And I don't recall, probably a week and a half to kind of write a treatment that I thought was acceptable. I actually broke that treatment with a friend. He didn't go on to write the screenplay with me, but and then maybe, as I recall, in those days I was really cooking, so maybe a month, maybe a little longer. Of course, I shined it up when I returned to it, but no sooner than I finished it than another Edgar Allan Poe project came out and landed with a huge thud, a movie with John Cusack called The Raven.
Oh, that's the John Cusack movie. Okay.
Yeah, and no one wanted anything to do with Edgar Allan Poe at that time. It was just before what I mean. Now we know, like, that wouldn't stop anybody. Now everybody wants, the brand recognition. It markets itself, and so there's been this feeding frenzy now for a long time on this kind of thing. But then it was just before that, and so that movie kind of tanked, and no one wanted to touch Edgar Allan Poe. So
Sure.
I put it in the drawer for a long time until I tripped on a kind of production strategy that I thought was really viable, and it seemed like the time was right.
What was that strategy?
Looking for filming locations for a different project, and I was investigating Latvia, where I ended up filming Raven's Hollow, and I saw some terrain, I saw some buildings that were remarkably close to period appropriate. And now we ended up building a whole bunch more, but just to find a few things that actually looked like 1830s upstate New York was kind of amazing. I thought, oh, I can use this, I can stand on this, and it will be affordable. If you have to build all that from scratch, wow, it's especially in the US. So it just kind of reopened my mind to this script I had in the drawer and pulled it out, sent it to a couple of key people, and without going into that long process, it was the right time, obviously, and we were able to finance it.
As happens more frequently than you would expect, two projects will come out and be released sort of around the same time. Right now, you have this other Edgar Allan Poe project called The Pale Blue Eye, starring Christian Bale, and it's on Netflix, a Scott Cooper movie. And I've seen both. And I got to tell you, yours is, I think, I like The Pale Blue Eye, but guess what? I like yours better. I think yours is a more interesting, more entertaining movie. I think The Pale Blue Eye is an attempt to be a little too smart, and it's a little too slow for my taste. It's beautiful, and the acting is terrific, but I like yours better. So if you want to see an Edgar Allan Poe movie, I'm saying to the listeners, check out Chris's movie, which is Raven's Hollow. Where can it be found?
In North America, it's on Shudder, streaming on Shudder. And so the great news is that Shudder offers a trial week for free. So if you want to see Raven's Hollow, you can see it for free.
And both movies, well, your movie is the lead character, your protagonist is Poe, but in The Pale Blue Eye, it's not Poe. Poe is a side character to the lead character, whose name is Landor. And so there are differences, and yet the similarities with it being at the U.S. Academy and so on, it's a little freakish about some of the similarities. Both are mystery stories. It's a little weird.
When I finally got around to watching it quite recently, I would see a scene here or there, and a moment I go, oh, I remember when I shot that moment. I remember when we did that scene. I mean, it was funny. I was laughing because it just reminds you that we're all playing in the same sandbox with kind of the same toys. And there are certain dramatic devices that are timeless and effective, and we all go there. And I can't really address them, a couple of them specifically, because they would be double spoilers. But there was one that I just, it was insane that we had come across virtually an identical situation for Poe to be in. But I'm so happy for what you said, because this was what I had hoped for. Quite honestly, I knew going into my production, theirs had also been announced, and I knew they had all the money in the world, and it was a David and Goliath kind of thing. And not that we were really in battle with them, but I just kind of secretly was hoping that when it all came out, people would say, well, they had all the money, but this is the one that's cool. And so
yours is
hopefully
much more fun. Theirs is much more straightforward and tries to be very twisty. Yours is a much more accessible story, I think. By the way,
wow.
curiously enough, most of the Pale Blue Eye was shot right here in Pittsburgh. How about
Well,
that? How
that's
about that for weird
good.
coincidences?
Right. Now, didn't Poe spend a little time in Pittsburgh?
He well might
Was it?
have, but
He
I
was
am
in
not enough of a
Philadelphia, I think. I can't remember.
I'm
Anyway,
not
not
enough of a Poe expert to tell you where he was, but for sure the movie was shot a large part of it here, both the interiors and exteriors. So
well, with your incredible long silver hair, you could have been in the movie.
like, if someone would only think to cast me every now and then, but nobody does.
You got to
I'm
put
just
yourself out there, man.
I
Come
know
on.
one of these days. So let's talk for a moment about your writing process, about what you do to create. Do you think of yourself primarily as a writer, or do you think of yourself as all of the above, a writer, director, and producer, and that's what you are? Or are you really a writer who then produces and directs to protect your work?
That's a really good question, and I have reflected on it a lot lately. I think that I will always think of the foundation as writing, period. It's where I started, and I think all of us in the business, whatever we're doing, there's some foundational thing we stand on, no matter how much we evolve into other, aspects of the process. But even more so lately, I just think more in terms of the concept of storyteller. And I don't know why, in my mind, that makes a difference. But as a director, when I'm directing my scripts from time to time, the directing is 100% an extension of the writing. It is a continuation of a storytelling process. To me, it seems like it's very much the same thing. I'm just trying to get this story told a certain way. And I think that this is what fires me. I'm curious in the world because it's just like the app running in the background. It's always there, looking for another story, listening for a great story. And I'd almost rather sit with friends and tell stories, and then this happened to me when I was in Amsterdam. And then, I like to tell stories more than anything. And so for me, it's all one big process.
It's all of a piece because without the writer, you don't really have anything to produce. And without the production, you don't really have a movie. A screenplay is not a movie, it's a blueprint for a movie. But it's all pulling toward the same thing, which, as you say, is the telling of a tale. It's storytelling.
And I've absolutely found that the screenwriter in me is affected and improved by the director in me. And I wish that the
How so?
economic,
In what way?
well, when you have to put it on its feet, when it has to become real, when you have to shoot it, you have to understand it. There's no room for fuzziness, and writers sometimes can leave a little bit to the imagination. And I've just gotten sharper and cleaner and more aware of why any given beat works or should be there or shouldn't, because I just know I've written a thing and then I read it back and then the director steps in and says, yeah, but why is that there? What am I supposed to do with that exactly? Tell me. And I realized, yeah, I liked that moment, but it doesn't do anything. It's just a texture, but
so I would like to think that you, as the screenwriter, you are informing the director as to what it is ultimately is going to be made. But how then, and you're already maybe alluding to it, how important is it then for the director and you to talk to the screenwriter on a regular basis? Is that going on all the time, or is it only after you've written a draft or two do you go back and think as a director, or is it happening all the time?
I'm afraid it's on some level happening all the time. Sometimes I have to actually switch it off. I have to tell the director to shut up because not every script is meant to be in the budget range that I so far work in as a director. I don't have a Jim Cameron kind of budget. And for example, I was doing a script recently for De Laurentiis films, and it's a really wonderful, wonderful piece. And I had to kind of shove that director away a little bit because that director has learned to try to contain resources, to try to be clever about how, and this project needed to be, bigger. just simply bigger. And so I had to let the writer be unleashed a little bit, not held down by the director. But it goes back and forth. It goes both ways. And I was really affected years and years and years ago by a negative review of somebody else's project, a film called The Bridges of Madison County, if you remember that
I
film.
do.
And I remember maybe it was Pauline Kael, right? And the review really essentially was, I don't think this is great directing at all. It's a lovely film, but this is not great directing. This director is doing nothing more than servicing the script. And that was kind of wild and earth-shattering because, of course, my bias is always for the script. Without the script, there's nothing. Forget it. There's nothing. But at the same time, it was that recognition that in this collaborative process, a director really is meant to bring more. And we always want more, better, interesting. And that critique was effectively saying this director isn't bringing anything else to the table.
And of note, that particular movie was directed by an Oscar-winning legend named Clint Eastwood.
Exactly. Exactly. And so what can I say? There's something going on, but I think it's storytelling. Of course, we know how powerful and interesting that collaborative process is.
I ask lots of guests this question, and it's always get interesting answers. What for you makes a good story good?
For me, I think it is ultimately being transported. It doesn't matter if it's into outer space on the Enterprise or if it's into a different culture with different people that I've never been around. I want to go somewhere else. I'm very familiar with my life and the mundane reality around me. I want to go someplace that really opens me up to something else. And I, of course, have a little taste for fantastical. That's always going to be there. Although I've noticed as an older person, as I get a little older, I find the comfort of clever mysteries and thrillers and just maybe what lies in the human heart is just as fantastical when you explore it the right way.
I think that's what happens to most people as they become wise and have families and all the rest of it. Your tastes shift, and I think that's an inevitability for most people, not everybody, but most people. What would you say is the most difficult or challenging thing about writing screenplays?
I think that the hardest part of it is that it is really such an unnatural form that you're trying incredibly hard to make seem incredibly natural because the medium is so naturalistic. So how do you write dialogue that is ridiculously minimal compared to how people speak, compared to what you'd find in the theater, compared to anything, and make it seem absolutely natural? I think that's the hardest thing. I think people don't realize how challenging it is.
For sure. Most people have no idea how hard it is to write a script.
Yeah, they watch this stuff all the time. They consume it, and it seems
easy,
kind of straightforward to them.
Yeah, it looks easy,
and it's not. So I mean, there's that. There's figuring out that trick. Then there's maybe the next thing is to really make sure that it is about imagery. That cinema is image, and not be seduced by language. This is a real trick for somebody coming out of a different field of writing, whether it's books or whether it's prose or whatever. It has to come alive imagistically. You need to be speaking in image every bit as much as you're speaking in words. I think that's a huge thing. And then there's this other component that I think about a lot, and that is concept versus execution and relative value. And
explain that further.
Yeah, well, a friend who did go to film school told me about this wonderful exercise that she had in school, and it was the teacher gave everybody a setup. The setup is the guy runs into a room and announces he's got a bomb strapped to his waist. That's the setup. Their assignment was to execute this in 3 different ways. One, in an episode of a scene, it's an episode of Cheers. One, it's an episode of, I think, Hill Street Blues, and one, it's an episode of Dynasty or something like this. Right. And the point of the exercise was that it's all about execution, 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 execution.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not going to be the same scene on Cheers as it is on Hill Street Blues. So is that concept really as important as the execution? And I loved that when I heard that. And I was like, oh, gee, I should have gone to film school because I would have got to do cool things like that. But over time, I have been thinking and thinking and thinking about it and realized that I just think, no, it's half right, but it's not entirely right, that there is still some very difficult, intangible thing to get hold of that is related to concept, and not just high concept as we, was really shoved down our throats at a certain period of time in LA. It's Die Hard in a helicopter or whatever. That
in a
stuff that
bus.
yeah. Okay, that's a high concept, but really, no, more delicate than that. But how can I say that there's a spark in the concept that really makes it greater than it is.
Well, the writer is not only going to set story, they're going to set character, you're going to set tone, they're going to set genre. All those things are set by the writer, right?
Absolutely. But I think there is an absolute ocean of scripts out there. And let's just throw out all the amateurish junk, horrible scripts that are out there. And we know they are because we've not only read a few, but we probably both know readers in Hollywood who will tell you they can literally read 100 before they find one that's a gem, or they read 500 before they find one that's a gem that they can really recommend. But throw away all those terrible ones, and then you've got a whole sea of very effective, nicely crafted scripts. They're good and they're absolutely shootable, but are they special? Do they lift off in any way? Are they memorable? Do they have something? It's like a spark, and that's, I guess that's for the writer the equivalent to the movie star thing that they used to say, right? You've either got it or you don't. What is it? Hard to really identify, but you know it when they have it. And I think that's a part of a script too. Okay, you've got a nice structure, you've done it all, kind of follow the rules, and there's a nice arc and this character, but what makes it special?
You're suggesting, I think, the checking of all the boxes, that you're doing all the right things, story and character, and making it work and so on. But I think this little X factor you're talking about, which you can't control, you can't buy, and you can't train, is essentially the writer has developed his or her voice, and that voice comes through in some compelling way.
100%. And it may be that the vast cottage industry that has come up over the last few decades of how to has gotten so prescriptive that it has in a way killed this important spark that you're calling it the voice, and it is a voice, but it's even deeper than a voice. It is what you have inside you that needs to come out, not just something you need to say, but just a true impulse, whether it's to tell a story, whether it's to convey an idea, whether it's to move people, whatever it is, intrinsically human, and it's incredibly old, and it is the core of storytelling. And storytelling is, in a way, everything that we all do, even those of us, those who don't identify themselves as storytellers.
Oh, well, we communicate every day by telling each other stories. I've been saying that for a long time.
Absolutely. And we define ourselves through the story we tell ourselves. And I guarantee you, your story you tell you about yourself is an interesting version of you, and somebody else might have a different version of you, and I have my version of me. I have my story, and I define myself by my story.
Mm-hmm.
And we're all doing this, but it's human, it's us. And I'm not saying that these books and strategies and gurus don't have some place, but it's a very dangerous realm because it can really kill a natural instinctive and really, sort of delightful process of humans are completely unpredictable, but they're not unpredictable if you're following a rule book that tells you that at this stage they will then do this will happen. So this is important stuff.
I've been having just a fantastic conversation with my good friend Chris Hatton on StoryBeat today, and we've been speaking for about an hour at this point, and we're going to wind this thing down a little bit. And I'm just wondering, in all of your many experiences, can you share with us a story that's either weird, strange, quirky, offbeat, or just plain funny, beyond the ones you've already told us?
Yeah, the best stories have nothing to do with the business and can never be told on this podcast, sadly. So
is that because they're too rude or weird or what?
I will never say. I must not tell.
They're too personal.
Maybe they're just too far off topic. But one came to mind. I'd forgotten this the other day, and I was thinking this is so illustrative of the weirdness of just how things happen in LA in the business. Many, many years ago, I was doing a ride along in Altadena. Ride along is going out with a police officer. And Altadena, for people who don't know, at least at that time, was pretty gang heavy, rough neighborhood. And I was very lucky. I wanted to do this ride along for a script, and I ended up in a car with a sergeant. So this is a guy who, through the course of this night, really rolled up on many, many, many different scenes. The regular officers kind of like get caught up in whatever they're going to be caught up in, and then that's it, one thing for the night. But that night we rolled through a lot of unusual happenings. I asked him later, I said, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most kind of intense night you'd tend to experience, what's tonight? And he said it's an 8, which I thought was pretty lucky draw for me.
Yeah.
And in that night, we rolled up on there was a supermarket robbery at gunpoint. There was another thing with a gun. I can't even remember right now off the top of my head. And then there was a big gang shooting. And we rolled into all of these things. And when we got to the gang shooting, and I'd had to sign the thing you have to sign. Maybe you've done this too, Steve, but you have to sign if you get killed on this night. It's not our fault. It's your fault. But we rolled up on this thing, and he had me hide behind the engine block of the car. So, and things happened. The helicopters were out, and there were radio cars everywhere. And there was a foot chase. They went chasing after this shooter, and eventually they got everybody they were trying to get or whatever. And I was let out of this car because it was now safe. But there's all kinds of procedure and stuff that happens after that. And I was parked with these uniformed cops who were standing over a gun. A gun had been ditched, in some weird corner of a neighborhood, and they had to stand over the gun to make sure nothing happened to the gun until whoever was supposed to come collect the gun, put it into evidence, came. So they're just standing around rapping, right? They're just talking about, I got to get home, and I wonder how late this night's going to go on, and that kind of stuff. And I'm standing there with them, and it was great because it's real. Oh, cops are just real people talking about mundane stuff. And then inevitably, so what are you doing here? Oh, well, I'm a screenwriter, and I'm just doing a ride along. And oh, okay, yeah, and I was kind of embarrassed because I felt like, yeah, I'm just a weenie regular guy, and you guys are tough cops. And this cop says to me, well, what have you done? Do I know any of it? Do I know anything? I said, yeah, probably not, but I did do some Star Trek. And then of course, he kind of blooms a little bit, and he says, oh, I love Star Trek. Do you know Chase Masterson? And I don't know if you know Chase, Steve. I think you might.
I've met her, sure.
And I said, no, I don't really know Chase, but I know the show she's on, of course. And He said, well, I know her. I know her personally. I'm in her fan club and I know her and I like her and I get along with her. And if you ever want to meet her, I can introduce you. And I said, okay, that's interesting. At this time, I was just getting ready to cast my very first independent film, very small indie that I made. First time I was a writer director. And one of the lead roles was a woman about her age. And I thought, well, maybe I could get that Star Trek actress. So I called this cop because we'd traded numbers for because he was a big geek, he's a big Star Trek geek. So of course we traded numbers and we ended up being friends for quite a while. But anyway, one thing led to another. He introduced me to her and she took the lead role in my film.
Well, there you go.
So there's that, that's one. And I told you Star Trek would come back and back and back in my story. So when I did when I did the second episode of Star Trek that was sort of Data as Frankenstein, in the episode, Data has lost his memory and a little girl gives him a new name, and I needed to give Data a new name. And I really didn't know what to call him, but my closest friends at the time were a couple that lived in Boise, Idaho, and they had a 10-year-old son, and his name was Jaden. And in those days, this was a name no one really heard, okay? And I thought, well, I'll just call him Jaden. And I integrated this in, and somehow that name stuck all through all the iterations, and it ended up the filmed name for the character, which was cool because this kid was just, blew his mind and all that. But maybe it was a year and a half to 2 years later, the real Jaden's mom called me and she said, you're not going to believe this. I was in the supermarket and I was in Albertsons and I heard some lady scolding a little bitty kid who was being naughty, and she was saying, Jaden, 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 Jaden. And I went up to her because, and my friends thought they had invented this name. It was that uncommon, if you can imagine. They thought they'd invented this name. And she said, excuse me, that's a lovely name for your little boy. Can I ask you where that came from? And the lady said, oh yeah, we heard it on an episode of Star Trek. and of course, my friend, she said, well, you're not going to believe this, but and of course the woman thought she was nuts. And then this started happening more and more. It would happen to me. It happened to me in a hotel in Portland, Oregon, and then I saw an article online. And this guy had done the research on celebrity names, goofy names, and whatnot, and the phenomenon of the name Jaden, and had identified the air date of that episode as the moment when that name started to rise into a spike, went really fast. That episode coincided with this. Suddenly, Jaden went everywhere.
Wow.
And I saw Wikipedia, reported that as well and stuff. So there, my friend, is the power of a brand.
You you have created Jadens all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely. It might be the most, the biggest thing I will ever do was drop that name in that episode.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So, all right, last question for you today, Chris. You've given us a ton of very interesting thoughts to chew on, and a lot of advice as we've spoken, but I'm wondering if you have a single solid piece of advice or a tip that you like to give people who are either just starting out in the business, as you did one day, or maybe they're in a little bit and trying to get to that next level.
One that comes to mind for me, and ever since I got out of LA, I think about this kind of thing more and more, and that is, don't let anybody tell you how it's supposed to be done, because in the business and probably other businesses, this is the game. No, you have to do it this way or you're not doing it right. And that is just simply not true. There's a million ways to do it. I think, again, circling back on my experience with Star Trek, here's the thing I didn't tell you that's very interesting. I did not know that they had a list of rules that were essentially commandments that had been written by Gene Roddenberry. We will not ever do this. We will not ever do this. We must never do that. There's like 7 or 8 of these things, and they were commandments. And the number one commandment on the list was, we will never do space pirates. And I went in and sold them a script about space pirates. Had I known at that age, at that time of that list, had I been aware of it, I would have accepted it, and I would never have written that concept that I just wrote because I thought it was a great story. And it was entertaining enough that they wanted to break their rules. And I actually read an interview where Rick Berman talked about he had a bust of Gene Roddenberry in his office. And when they were doing that episode, he threw a towel over the head of the bust so he couldn't see what they were doing. So I think it's, there's a thing in the culture of the town that's very much given to, this is how you have to do it. You have to do it this way, this way, this way. And I think that's a little bit suspicious. But at the same time, then there's another thing too, which is I would say that just from a real practical standpoint, that when you finally write your script, when you have that concept and you think it's really, really fantastic and really original, you need to know, and this is the sacred truth, your very cool offbeat original idea that you have never ever seen before, I guarantee you somebody else out there has had that idea, and probably multiple people have had that idea, and there's probably already been 2 or 3 scripts circulating with that idea. And no matter how esoteric and weird you think it is, this is still true. So just bear that in mind when you go out there.
Well, that is extraordinarily useful and wise advice, because the truth is probably there's already a movie out there, and there's no way that any single human, I don't care how many movies you watch in your lifetime, you cannot watch them all or even come close to scratching the surface of watching them all. And so the chances of your story being out there, when I was teaching screenwriting for all the years that I taught screenwriting, almost every single year in a class called narrative structure, I would have some student almost always raise their hand midway through the semester and say, you know what, I've come up with a really unique idea for a story that no one's ever done before. And I would kind of laugh and I'd say, okay, tell me what that story is. And they would pitch some story out. And I would say, you mean it's like this movie, that movie, this movie, that movie, and that movie? And the look on their face as their jaw dropped, because everything has basically been done. It's all about what you talked about earlier, execution. How do you execute the idea and make it unique in its execution, not necessarily in the basic concept? Am I correct?
You are correct. Did anybody ever surprise you?
No, not once.
Not once?
Not once. No, some of the ideas were good. It wasn't like they were a bad idea, but they were convinced that no one had ever conceived of it before. And then I would say, you mean it's like this, this, and this? And they'd go, oh, because they'd never even heard of those movies.
Well, so that would be, that's an interesting thing, because I think that is definitely, a message to the younger generations. And I don't mean the greener writers, but I mean really the younger writers, is you probably need to look backwards as much as you're looking forwards, that there's an incredible body of work behind you. And if you think that movies only started 10 years ago, or maybe in the olden days, like 20 years ago, you're really robbing yourself of the chance to actually deliver something that is special and might break through. There are a billion people who want that opportunity, and you strengthen yourself by understanding what came before, and that oh, maybe my idea isn't really that special if they did it already back in 1950. Maybe I need to zazz it up a little bit. Just because you're young and you've had an idea doesn't necessarily mean it's really good. And I think actually when I was doing some research into the directing of Raven's Hollow, I found myself looking back at horror films from like the 1920s, and I was shocked at how far out they were, how progressive and dangerous and flat out freaky some of them were. I would, my own bias was well in evidence there. I had no sense that they had pushed the boundaries as far as they had back then. Some really scary stuff. So I think, for anybody who wants to get through, you should be studying the old stuff. Go check out Lawrence of Arabia. That's a great freaking movie, right? There's a million things like that.
Well, no doubt. And people sometimes forget, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in the early 1800s. Stoker
and we
wrote
keep making it and making it.
And Stoker goes and writes Dracula in the latter 1800s. Robert Louis Stevenson writes Jekyll and Hyde in the late 1880s. This stuff is not unique to the modern generation. Chris Hatton, this has been a fantastic hour plus on StoryBeat, and I'm so glad we had a chance to see one another again and to have a lovely chat on StoryBeat and hear about your career and how you do things.
Yeah, it was great. I really appreciate it. A lot of fun. Thank you.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden. And may all your stories be unforgettable.